Teresa felt a chill go through her chest that she couldn't explain. What? No, you didn't. It's really weird, Ray remarked. I had a strange feeling of déjà vu when I picked up the phone to call you, as though I had already given you a call today. Teresa softly let a tear slide down her face. She was at a loss for words. Is everything all right? Ray inquired. She whispered, Baby, I miss you. Ray laughed. He answered, more as a question than a declaration. I miss you too. See you in a couple of hours. No, she responded, you won't. Reese, what? Huh? He said, then paused. Have you heard it? Teresa ended the call. Her mind awoke with bewilderment and a strange feeling of optimism. There had been a sense of inevitability in every previous conversation. Ray would always die on the floor of his office restroom, regardless of what Teresa said to him. However, he appeared to recall something today, and Ray had guided their talk in a new direction. And Teresa started to question what would happen if she tried to exert more pressure and try harder to persuade Ray to do something different. When Ray called the following day, Teresa took over the discussion right away. Ray, please pay close attention to what I have to say and respond as quickly as you can. What is the number of exits from your office? I mean, outside of your department. What? He asked. Respond to me, she demanded. The primary door is there, the IT department is straight ahead, and I head down the main hallway to the left. The second door leads through HR. However, it only connects to the main hallway at the opposite end. The door to the balcony comes next. You ask me this, but why? Snatch up your keys. Avoid grabbing anything else, Teresa urged. Check with the IT division. Avoid going down the hallway. Go to your vehicle and head home. Right now. After a little silence, Ray remarked, All right, I'll be there. The line then died. As she waited, Teresa found herself breathing heavily. She paced. Her phone rang once more a few moments after that. Reese, pay attention to me. A man with a gun is there. Frustrated, Teresa screamed and tossed her phone across the room, where it skidded across the floor and struck the carpet. Teresa said, Ray, the balcony outside your department, when he called again. Are there stairs leading to the courtyard? Yes, he said. Why are you asking? And from there you can reach the parking lot? Indeed. What is happening? Teresa yelled, Go. Avoid asking me any questions. Simply exit through the balcony doors and get to your vehicle. Now do it. Return home. Is everything all right? He inquired. She called out, Go, and hung up. 1 minute went by, and then 2. Teresa stared at her phone, breathing heavily. It was 5 minutes before Ray called. At last, she managed to breathe. On her bed was Teresa. She was hunched over her phone, her back hurting. There was no second phone call for the first time since the day he passed away, and Teresa was unsure of what to do next. When she heard the front door open, she was in a state of almost careless daze. She almost let out a cry as she jumped. She heard footsteps as the door closed. Leaping from the bed, she ran from the bedroom to the entryway, along the hallway. Unbelievably, there he was, his tall, gangly, silly-looking yet attractive self, despite the fact that his complexion was so pale that it nearly turned blue. His brow was furrowed in concern, but he smiled at her. She rushed to him and sprang into his arms as his mouth opened to ask a question. Teresa gasped. He was freezing, deathly cold. His voice was shaking and overused, like it was on the mornings when he had first woken up, when he questioned, "Is everything okay?" Teresa sobbed into his shoulder and held him closer than ever before, saying, "Now everything is all right." Ray reciprocated by holding her close, but his hands felt like ice on her back, his body rigid against hers, and even though her ear was pushed hard against his chest, she was unable to feel his heartbeat, a detail she soon disregarded. Teresa made the decision to open up to him. The shooting at Ray's office, his death, his funeral, and his daily phone calls were all part of the story she told while sitting at the kitchen table and holding his cold hand in both of hers. As she talked, he gazed at her emotionlessly, his face showing no signs of surprise, perplexity, or even memory. She took a seat back in her chair and gave him some thought. As she gazed at him, she thought dutifully. He didn't feel hungry. He had no thirst. Until Teresa told him to get up, he was happy to sit quietly. Ray never asked her what was wrong, despite the fact that her heart wrenched from the conflicting feelings of relief and dreadful confusion. She observed him intently, unable to conceal her obvious concern. Ray followed Teresa to their bedroom that night, where he stood obediently at the foot of the bed and gazed at her as though he had never been there before. She discovered that he was not wearing the suit he had been buried in, the suit he had worn on their wedding day, but rather his work clothes when she undressed him. Telling him to lie down, she drew back the covers. In mute obedience, he did so. She kissed him after sliding in next to him. She recognized and was unfamiliar with his kiss. There was no warmth, and his lips, which had previously always been strong and forceful, were now gentle and passive. Teresa almost started crying as they clasped once more, but his taste and texture were the same. Teresa led the way when they made love, when Ray had usually taken the lead. Her body shuddered at the coldness of his touch, but her heart was bursting with the happiness of being held by her husband again. Teresa reached out without opening her eyes when she woke up the following morning, sunshine brushing her eyelashes. Her fingers, however, found nothing. The sheets were drawn up, and Ray's side of the bed was deserted, as though he had never been there. She suddenly sat up. "Ray!" she yelled. No response was found. She called for him multiple times while she looked around the house. However, he had vanished. Feeling bewildered and sad, she went back to the bedroom. Where was he now? Would he also return? Then her phone rang just after midday. Ray appeared on the screen. She responded to it. "Ray?" He said, "Reese," in a voice that sounded even more strained and unaccustomed than before. "Don't be concerned. I am aware of a shooter. I'm returning home." Teresa put her phone down as the call died. She became aware that she could barely feel anything anymore, as her chest clenched in a flurry of feelings, including fear, frustration, hope, and sadness. But he did return home, and they were caught in a new vicious circle that became their new norm. His individuality was fading farther into the lifeless shell he was turning into, a void behind the eyes that had once been so passionate and vibrant. He would return home each day, feeling colder to the touch and looking paler every day. He needed to be told to sit, eat, and take a bath by Teresa. Teresa became his devoted but bewildered and a little afraid caregiver, and he was like an old man losing his faculties. Every morning, Ray would call Teresa from work just after noon to let her know he was coming home, and his side of the bed would be empty once more. His speech sounded more like it was being dragged across stones each time, Teresa noted, he thought, like his vocal cords are decaying. Shortly afterward, his face started to match his speech. As his face grew even more paler and his cheeks more sunken, he started to appear more physically frail, his towering frame starting to bow, his eyes big in their sockets. For months, Teresa let this pattern go on, her love for her husband keeping her trapped in a hellish existence, but she was also quickly collapsing, her mental and emotional health deteriorating as Ray's face did. He had called her and said, "I'm coming home," in a voice that was almost unrecognizable to her, like dusty rocks being rubbed together. She had said, "Wait," Don't, Ray. Stay away from home. Remain there. It's all right. Remain there. No, he said slowly and emotionlessly. No, I will die if I remain here. I'm returning home. Teresa had hung up, cried, and waited for her husband to come back. Her husband's death caused her to cry. She cried because, although being alive, he continued to die every day in front of her. She cried because, in whatever recurring cycle his death and their love had produced, she felt bonded to him. She cried because she felt completely alone, even though they were back together. Teresa finally made a choice on the day she committed suicide, one that came to her naturally and fearlessly. The thought was actually the first consolation she had experienced in the years since Ray's passing. Maybe dying herself was the way out of this living torment, specifically, to pass away next to Ray while they were sharing a bed. And maybe she would be gone when he left in the morning. Together, but gone. That afternoon, she gave me a call to share her story, her plan, and to say goodbye. As she described the specifics of her wretched life in the months following Ray's passing, I listened in horrified astonishment. Even though I couldn't believe her story, I could tell by the sound of her weary but resolute voice that my daughter was telling the truth. "Is Ray present now?" I questioned her. "Yes," she replied wearily. "Want to speak with him?" I remained silent until I heard Teresa remark, "It's Dad," in a distant voice. "Speak with him." A shuffling noise was heard, and then the breathing became ragged. "Ray?" I spoke, and to my astonishment, I could hear my voice quivering. I could hear him trying to answer, but he didn't. As he tried to speak, all I could hear were the sounds of his labored breathing and the hazily familiar tones of his voice. However, his voice was wasted, and his sentences were jumbled. Teresa returned the phone. "Daddy, I have to leave now." "I don't do this, baby," I replied, attempting to keep my composure while crying. "I cherish you. Your mom adores you. Let us assist you. There must be an alternative." Teresa broke down in tears. "Daddy, there's no other option. There is no other option." "No," I demanded. "You still have a lot of life left to live. From there, let me take you away. Come on over here. If you're not present, Ray might stop coming to you." Even though I wasn't sure I believed her completely, I felt like I was playing along with her. She took a deep, worn-out breath and continued, "Daddy, there's something else. I am expecting a child." "You are—" I began, then halted. I, I was having trouble breathing. I was having trouble breathing. I put it together in my head. Teresa was expecting a child, and it had been over a year since Ray's death. She responded to my unasked query by saying, "It's Ray's, but it's..." She let the statement unfinished. "I have no idea what that is. Daddy, I simply know I can't. I simply cannot," she cried. I begged her not to, but she ignored me and said her last goodbyes. After that, the call ended. You've already heard how the police located her. According to the autopsy, she had died from ingesting a significant amount of sleeping medication that her best friend Cheryl had kindly left behind. She had been several months pregnant, according to the autopsy. I demanded that her mother never know this information. Despite our distance and estrangement, a mother should be spared some atrocities when it comes to her own child. This is Teresa's narrative, as I mentioned, and her husband Ray's story. Even though it sounds fantastical, the narrative is actually factual, even if you don't believe me. Even though I had my doubts about Teresa when she originally told me her story 2 weeks ago, I now believe her. I no longer question a single detail about her, because she calls me every day to reiterate everything. "What day is it?" she inquired. "Oh, money," he declared. "What's happening? What's the matter?" "Tuesday," she declared. No, Ray started, then stopped. For a minute there was silence on both sides of the phone. Did you hear that? Ray asked. She said, hear what? Then she heard it, and she experienced a dreadful sense of déjà vu. Over the phone, there was a loud report, a distant bang. Ray asked, what was that? And based on the sound of his voice, he was moving. Teresa said, Ray, hold on. Teresa heard a lady scream and then another loud report, closer but still far away. Ray declared, I'm going to see what's going on. I'll give you a call back. And all her life she worried Teresa had been listening. She heard people and they screamed for her. With her hair falling in front of her eyes, Teresa placed her phone on the bathroom sink and gazed down at it. Trying to get rid of the disorientation that was making it hard for her to concentrate, she vigorously shook her head. Ha! Frustrated, she raked her fingers through her hair and then tugged at it. Resuming her phone call, she dialed Ray's cell, voicemail. She dialed his desk phone, voicemail. She dialed his office's reception. She was notified in the outgoing message that the office would be closed for the rest of the week due to the unfortunate events of yesterday. With a troubled brow, Teresa placed the phone back on the sink. It rang again a few seconds later. Ray appeared on the screen. She didn't say anything in response. Reese, Ray spoke in a panicked whisper, pay attention to me. A man with a gun is there. Teresa's hand shook so much that she could hardly hold the phone to her ear as she started to cry. Down the hall from my office, I'm in the restroom. He killed Mark Baby. I witnessed it. Ray's voice wavered, almost bursting into tears. Teresa remained silent. Ray added, I called the police. They are en route. He drew a deep, shuddering breath. Teresa lowered her knees to her chest and sat on the floor. Her back and forth rocking started. Ray remarked, I have no idea where he is right now. At the end of the hallway, I caught sight of him. I witnessed him shooting Mark. Since this door was the closest, I entered. I'm not sure if he noticed me. However, the door isn't locked. One of the cubicles is where I am. There was silence for a long time. Talk to me, Reese, Ray said frantically. Ray, she uttered while crying. That was all she could manage to say. Ray remarked, I have no idea who this guy is. He has on a mask. He is, I believe. However, Ray abruptly stopped speaking when a loud, unsettlingly close bang sounded. He paused and inhaled deeply, trembling. Reese, he said, I love you. Teresa heard a door being kicked open and colliding with a wall over the phone. Ray let out a gasp. Ray's frantic protest, the sound of the gunshot, and the sound of the restroom stall door being kicked open were all replayed for Teresa. Teresa then experienced the sadness of her husband's passing for the second time in the silence that followed. She kept the call a secret. Not her mother, not Cheryl. She was unable to explain it to anyone, let alone herself. Throughout the day, the two had kept her company, taking calls, interacting with worried well-wishers, trying to persuade Teresa to eat, and handling the specifics of Ray's burial and viewing, which were set for Saturday night and Sunday morning, respectively. The main reason the two of them were there, though, was to ensure Teresa wasn't alone. When she was conscious, they handled her like a frail old porcelain doll. Even without Cheryl's pharmacological assistance, Teresa slept for the majority of the day. Her mother was upset about the fact that she ate so little. 2 days after Ray's passing, on Wednesday at noon, she was still in bed when her cell phone phoned. Ray appeared on the screen. She started to cry silently as her body turned numb. She responded to it. Ray? She murmured. He questioned why did the man always get struck by a bike on his way to work. Teresa instantly hung up, then turned off her phone entirely and threw it away. She sobbed as she laid in bed. Teresa was alone herself in the house on Thursday, the third day. Cheryl and her mother hadn't left the house since Monday night because they had other things to do. Teresa had taken a shower, combed her hair, and even applied some cosmetics. As she did so, her arms felt heavy and feeble. However, she made an effort to grin wearily while insisting that she would be okay if her mother and best friend left her alone for a short while. Shortly after noon, she was seated at the kitchen table, her head hurting from the intense sunlight coming in through the windows after spending so much time in the dark of her bedroom, when her cell phone rang. With a feeble voice, she replied, "Because he was caught in a vicious cycle." Teresa briefly questioned whether Ray was actually there, as there was quiet on the other end. "At last," he chuckled and inquired, "How did you do that?" "I don't know," she said. "Are you all right?" he inquired. "You sound weird." Teresa inhaled deeply. "Are you familiar with Vincent Holland?" she inquired. "Yes, I believe he works in engineering?" He's not someone I know very well. I am aware that he eats an onion for lunch every day, just like an apple. I've never seen anything like it." Teresa remarked, "Ray, he has a gun." "What? How are you aware of that?" She answered, "Don't ask me that right now. He's going to start shooting people because he has a gun. You must leave." Reese, I don't. However, Ray came to a halt as they both heard a gunshot. "What was that?" "Hear me out," Teresa said. "You need to leave the building." Ray was quiet for a while. Then he said, all right, I'm leaving." The phone became silent after that. Staring at the phone, Teresa placed it on the table. Through a sunbeam that poured through the window and hit warmly on the back of her hand, dust drifted gently. She questioned how the sun kept shining, as though everyone else wasn't as engulfed in sorrow as she was. Once more, her phone rang. "Ray." She replied, "Baby?" In a whisper, Ray said, "I saw him." "Where have you gone?" she inquired. "Down the hall from my office. I'm in the restroom. Killed Mark, baby." Teresa slapped her phone back down on the table and hung up. She covered her eyes with her fists and sobbed. Teresa, Cheryl, and her mother were seated at the kitchen table on Friday just after noon. With the kitchen counters and almost every other surface covered in flowers and gift baskets, the three of them were sipping tea quietly. Teresa sat quietly, her eyes fixed on her cell phone, which rested on the table in front of her like a stupid blank slate, while Cheryl and Teresa's mother engaged in light talk. The hour of 12:03 passed without a call. Teresa gave herself a mocking laugh. She had purposefully made sure she wasn't by herself when Ray called her today. She wanted witnesses this time if he called again. However, she knew in her heart that if she wasn't alone, he wouldn't call. Cheryl said, "Is everything all right, Reese?" Teresa averted her gaze from the quiet telephone. She sipped her tea and muttered, "Yes." "I traveled from across the nation to attend Ray's funeral and viewing. I was friendly with Teresa's mother, but we also tried to stay away from one another for Teresa's sake." Her appearance astounded me. She was obviously exhausted, gaunt, and grieving, but she also appeared troubled in a way that deviated from ordinary sadness. Throughout those 2 days, I hugged her close multiple times, always at a loss for words, wishing there was something I could do to ease the burden of grief on her shoulders. Later on, Teresa informed me that she had put her phone aside during the 2 days of events. Ray's daily calls might come to an end after she had gone through the ritual of remembering him, seen his calm face as he lay dead in his casket, and watched with astonished disinterest as his body was lowered into the earth. On Monday, however, her phone rang once more while she was by herself at home for the second time in the week since Ray's passing. With a feeling of helplessness and longing in her breast, she thought about not answering it, but was unable to resist. "Ray?" she asked. "What caused the man to be struck by a bike on his way to work every time?" Teresa started crying when Ray stated it. Teresa lived in a fog for the next few days. Ray's call was always answered by her. On certain days, she allowed the conversation to continue as it had on the first day, savoring the brief moments when Ray was still content and alive. On other days, she would interrupt his joke to ask him a question, such as where he filed his insurance documents or where he had placed the key to the safety deposit box. Ray was perplexed, but helpful, and constantly responded to her inquiries. On certain days, she had used those first few seconds to tell him how much she loved him, and she had cried when he returned the favor by telling her how much he loved her. But then, too soon, their chat would end abruptly at the sound of a shot. Teresa had answered, "Hello, baby," and waited for Ray to start his bicycle joke when the phone rang one day, weeks later. Ray had said, "Reese, did I call you earlier today?" after a pause. This is my daughter's tale, not mine. Teresa was her name. She overdosed and committed suicide 2 weeks ago. Just before the act, she gave me a call to let me know what she was planning to do and why. Naturally, I begged her with tears in my eyes not to carry out what she had planned. However, she was adamant about her choice, and I became increasingly horrified to see that this was not a bluff or a last-ditch attempt to get attention or validation. I was positive she was already dead by the time she hung up the phone. As soon as she said, "Daddy, Ray is here," I knew. Knowing that the police would be able to get to her far before I could, I called them right away. However, I was also aware that it would be too late. The other side of the bed, Ray's side, was unoccupied, but they discovered her in bed, seemingly in a deep and restful sleep, with one hand stretched out to the side, palm up, fingers curled, as if clutching something. Possibly another hand. This is Ray's story as well. He passed away just over a year ahead of Teresa. He was shot twice, one in his right hand, which he had held out defensively. The bullet passed through his palm and his cell phone before becoming lodged in the bathroom wall's tile, where he had made one last-ditch effort to conceal. Alone on the chilly floor, he rapidly bled out as the second bullet struck his neck. That day, 9 individuals died in his office building, including him. Unaware that they would not be leaving the office alive at the end of the day, 8 of those individuals assumed it was just another Monday at work. The shooter, the 8th person killed, had no plans to leave. That day, during his lunch break, Ray had given Teresa a call. She was at home, and she had smiled when she saw his name buzzing and lighting up her cell. The couple had only been married for 3 months and were still in that youthful, ephemeral honeymoon phase. Ray would often use any opportunity to call his fiancée from work if he had the chance. "Hello?" she said, her voice beaming. Ray questioned, why did the man always get struck by a bike on his way to work? "I'm not sure," Teresa said. "What made him do that?" Ray explained, because he was caught in a vicious cycle. Teresa laughed. Although the joke wasn't really hilarious, Teresa enjoyed Ray's enthusiasm in telling these terrible jokes more than the punchline itself because he had always enjoyed cheesy humor. For example, he had initially won her over with a crazy pickup line. 2 years ago, when she was a stranger among a sea of people crowded into a mixer at one of her girlfriend's flats, he had murmured to her, "Can I put it in you? Are you aware of its composition?" Potential boyfriend. Teresa had burst out laughing. First of all, the pickup line was actually humorous, and 2, because Ray, who is tall and cute in a silly way, was so very delighted to use it on her. His smile was instantly charming and contagious. Even if the line had been awful, it had been effective. Since then, they have remained together. Teresa sat down at the kitchen table and asked, "How is your day progressing?" Ray replied, sarcastically living the dream. "In actuality, I had a successful presentation this morning. On Wednesday, I'm expected to provide it to senior personnel once more. The future appears bright. That's fantastic news, Teresa remarked. Ray stated with a tone of delight. It really is. We need to rejoice if this proposition is approved. Leave somewhere. Ray hesitated for a moment. He said, "That sounds like a wonderful idea," although he suddenly seemed a little preoccupied. "Do you have a specific location in mind?" Teresa pondered and responded, "I don't know. We are always welcome to use that cabin that Cheryl owns. Maybe we should follow up on that. Before we utilize it at all, she and Brad will sell it. It would be pleasant to escape." Ray didn't answer. "Baby?" Teresa said. A pause. Ray said, "Did you hear that?" Teresa said, "Hear what?" But she heard it before he could answer. A distant blast, a loud report, over the phone. "What was that, Ray?" He answered, "I don't know," and based on the sound of his voice, he was moving. He had a weak voice. "Ray." Teresa believed she heard a woman cry, but her palms went cold as she heard a second loud report, closer but yet distant. Ray declared, "I'm going to see what's going on. I'll give you a call back." Teresa responded, "Ray," but he was gone. After placing the cell phone on the table, she gazed at its dark screen. She abruptly left the kitchen table, went to the sink, and poured herself a glass of water, which she then drank. She stared at the phone and wished for it to ring once more so that Ray's name would appear. No, it didn't. Teresa hurried to retrieve it. She dialed Ray's mobile number. Voicemail was left. She dialed his desk phone. It went to voicemail as well. She dialed his office's reception. No response. Her hands shaking, she slapped the phone back down on the table. It was difficult for her to catch her breath, to avoid speculating, to persuade herself that what she had heard was not what she had assumed. After an endless moment, her phone rang. She grabbed it. "Ray?" she asked. "Baby," he whispered in a hushed, desperate voice. "A man with a gun is there." Teresa slumped in the seat. Unaware that she was whispering, she asked, "Where are you?" "Down the hall from my office. I'm in a restroom." "He killed Mark Reese." "I witnessed it. He sounded shaky, almost crying or in a panic." She said, "Hang up and call the police, Ray." "I did," he emphasized. "They are en route." "All right," she said. Remain composed. She told herself this just as much as she told Ray. She inquired, "Where is he?" "Oh, I'm not sure," he said. "At the end of the hallway, I caught sight of him. I witnessed him shooting Mark. Since this door was the closest, I entered. I'm not sure if he noticed me." She inquired, "Did you lock the door?" His voice hitched a little as he replied, The door doesn't lock. I'm in a cubicle here. It's secured." As the reality of Ray's predicament set in, Teresa started to sob quietly. She questioned, "Who is he?" "I'm not sure. He has on a ski mask, I believe. He's..." A loud bang, uncomfortably close, caused Ray to abruptly cease talking. Ray paused and inhaled deeply, trembling. His voice was much softer now, just audible, as he muttered, "I love you, Reese." She protested, "No," and slipped off the chair and onto the kitchen floor while holding the phone close to her ear. It was not the report of a gun, but there was another banging sound. It sounded like someone kicking open a door and colliding with a wall. Ray's breath came in sharp gasps. Teresa muttered, "Ray?" Boom. The sound of someone kicking a restroom stall door. "No," Teresa's whole body went numb as she heard Ray's cry of anguish. Teresa said loudly, "Ray?" Boom, the slamming sound of the stall door. Ray cried out, "No." "Ray!" shouted Teresa. Boom, the sound of a firearm. And then, as Teresa fought to breathe, there was silence in the house for a few seconds. She yelled at last. A man named Vincent Holland was the gunman. Ray's marketing office was just one story down from the engineering department, where he had previously worked. At least that's what the media was covering, an unhappy worker with manic depressive disorder. After killing 8 of his colleagues, Vincent turned the gun on himself when he heard sirens approaching. Teresa, the next 24 hours passed in a blur. She had made the required phone calls to friends and family, identified her husband's body, his face was pallid but clearly his, and responded to police questioning while in a daze of shock. Teresa had wept in the interim, her body crushed under the weight of an almost intolerable anguish, the physical agony of it enough to make her welcome the possibility that it may kill her. That would be a mercy, she thought. She had fallen into the deep, unnatural slumber of the drugged on the night of Ray's death, her body giving in to whatever cocktail her best friend Cheryl had insisted on giving her. Teresa had eaten all of the pills without asking or caring what they were, and she swiftly slid into the cozy embrace of sleep, where her sorrow was, at least momentarily, kept at bay. She briefly questioned why her chest felt so much when she woke up the following day. She remembered in a split second, and the tears came at once. Rolling over, she placed her palm on the chilly, empty mattress on Ray's side of the bed. She could hear people coming from down the corridor behind her, sobbing. Teresa's mother and Cheryl were having serious conversations. Teresa glanced at the timepiece. The time was little beyond noon. Cheryl slept for more than 11 hours as a result of taking sleeping drugs. Teresa purposefully pushed the grief down into her stomach as she sat up in bed and wiped the tears from her cheeks. Out of habit rather than necessity, she grabbed her phone from the nightstand and walked slowly to the bathroom, turning a switch. Her eyes were attacked by the light, and she briefly took in her own pathetic image, puffy eyes, splotchy cheeks, and a scarlet nose. She inhaled deeply and trembled. Then she jumped when her phone buzzed in her hand. Ray appeared on the screen. Teresa gazed at it, her mind racing with a mix of incredulity and perplexity. She responded to it. "Oh." It was a little more than a croak. Ray questioned, why did the man always get struck by a bike on his way to work? When Teresa eventually managed to breathe, it was a rattling gasp after she had battled to do so. As though running from what she was hearing, she unconsciously moved away from the mirror. She wondered whether yesterday's events had been nothing more than an amazing dream, as her mind raced with a sudden surge of hope that was fighting against her lingering sorrow. Ray came to the conclusion that it was because he was caught in a vicious cycle. "Ray?" asked Teresa. "Yes, darling?" he said. "What's the matter? The joke wasn't all that awful." "Where are you, Ray?" she inquired. "I'm at work," he responded, chuckling a little. "I just finished a meeting. My presentation went nicely. On Wednesday, I'm expected to provide it to senior personnel once more. The future appears bright." Teresa remained silent. "Are you all right, Reese?" he inquired. Teresa gazed at her Halloween mask of despair in the mirror. Her head, still kicking off the last of Cheryl's drugs, was a swamp of contradicting ideas, and the floor felt like it was tilting beneath her. "Reese?" he repeated. "I was young, inexperienced with money, and a new father. The pay I was receiving at my job in an office furniture factory was, at best, pitiful. I had recently separated from the mother of my child and was also making child support payments. I was forced to live at my father's house due to this grave condition, which was frustrating to say the least. He and I didn't get along, and I was in dire need of a new place to call home. It was difficult to find a place at the time when I could truly afford it. I required roommates. Thus, this search resulted in a partnership with two pals. I've known Jason and James since high school. They understood how difficult it was for me to find affordable housing, and they were much the same. While I was visiting Jason one day, he and James informed me about a place they had discovered through friends that they could rent. I was intrigued as soon as they told me about the location. The house was said to be huge and the rent was low. The landlord claimed that the house was more than a century old. 15 miles outside of town, it was in the countryside. It had a foyer, a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, 2 covered porches in front and back, 5 bedrooms, and 2 bathrooms. For a group of young men who wanted to have parties sometimes, the house's size and solitude looked perfect. Furthermore, the incredible monthly cost of just $150 looked too wonderful to be true. There were catches, of course, more noticeable than others, so we started looking at our possible rental property. The house itself was in poor condition, which was the first issue. However, the home itself appeared to be quite robust, and it wasn't quite condemnable status. In any case, we simply intended to remodel our private spaces. To be honest, we were all more worried about the absence of central heating and air than we were about the appearance. However, the idea of spending just $50 a month on a party pad in the boonies was too enticing to pass up. As an artist, I was also drawn to the seclusion. It would be wonderful to be able to paint in the country away from the bustle of the city. We started moving in after signing the lease. Within a short while, I began to hear somewhat unpleasant rumors about the place. Before I had even begun putting my belongings into the space, I had heard some of these stories. The first was while I was dining at Waffle House with a few of other pals, along with Jason and James. One acquaintance cautioned of something that sounded ridiculous at the time when he learned that we were going to rent the space. In a long series of party animals who had rented the apartment since the 1970s, he swore that the prior occupants, who were only a few years older than us, had been party animals. He claimed that the home's extensive damage was caused by legendary parties drawn by the long tradition of low rent and seclusion. Since the party aspect had also drawn us to the house, I assumed this to be completely accurate. I noted that the room I decided to reside in had writing all over the walls while we were eating and discussing the house. I mentioned that because the ceilings were so high, it would be difficult to repaint the walls. I guess I nicknamed it Woe Is Me Emo Crap because the material itself was poorly written and depressing. Someone else who was dining with us then told me that the former tenant of that room was a notorious Satan worshiper, and that in that very room he had performed a number of rites. They advised us to simply lock it up and refrain from using it. I dismissed this with a laugh, thinking I would just paint the walls and be done. The last tale we heard about the home that evening was a tale of riches buried inside its walls. Someone who had rented the house decades ago is said to have boarded up their life savings within the house. This narrative struck me right away as being absolutely absurd. Furthermore, any wealth would have been discovered by now with all the tenants since then. In any case, Jason had believed the possibility was promising. By then, we had heard enough tales. We didn't want rumors to alter our minds when our lease started in October. For me, the house's close proximity to my place of employment at the time was one of its main advantages. My workplace was only roughly a 5-minute drive away. I therefore started dropping by the residence after work the week before October. I took this action in order to renovate the space where I would live. Jason and James both worked late shifts, but I worked first shift. At first, they weren't present when I was. As far as attempting to work on my room without any interruptions, this worked really well for me. However, Unusual things began to happen during my first improvements, before I had even moved into the property. Like the others, my room was fairly spacious. It was roughly 30 by 30 and had a ceiling that was 15 high. The ceilings were so high that you needed a pole changer, so we hadn't installed ceiling lights yet. In fact, the Satan worshiper who had occupied my room had installed a red light in the ceiling, but I still lacked a secure way to replace it. I brought a stand-up lamp as a result. The stand-up lamp I brought hardly lit the room because it was so big, but I was eager to finish my room before I moved in. So I worked by lamplight. The first thing I wanted to address in my room when I arrived at 5:30 p.m. on a Tuesday was a misaligned section of the fireplace mantle. The front slat had come loose, but the rest of the mantle was made of wood. I started using a nail to pound the slat back into position after bringing a hammer, but as soon as I delivered the blow, a series of odd events started that permanently altered my life. I started to hear murmuring in between the banging that reverberated throughout the enormous, deserted mansion. It was strange, given that I was the sole occupant of the house. It sounded like a long metallic tube whispering straight into my ear. I was instantly unnerved by this. I made an effort to visualize the wind outside the home. Actually, the lone window in the room was closed, and the wind wasn't blowing. I put the hammer down on the mantle and stopped pounding. The murmuring went on, growing increasingly desperate. I decided to install a lock on the door and keep my tools there because I was uncomfortable but didn't want to pack them all up again. My room had only a single door, so I hastily changed the doorknob to a deadbolt. The faint whispering persisted sporadically while doing this. I was really anxious by the time I had the lock examined and operational. I didn't even bother to switch off the light. I quickly put the only key in my pocket, shut the door and the window, and hurried out. I came back the following night with newfound bravery. I chose to ignore the whispering since I had persuaded myself that it had been a natural event. I had determined that fixing the mantle was the top priority. There was nothing but darkness as I opened my room's door. The lamp had been switched off somehow. That struck me as odd, but when I turned the lamp on once more, I noticed something even stranger. I had previously left the hammer on the mantle, but it was gone now. It wasn't in the room at all. It was really concerning how a hammer that had been in a locked chamber vanished out of thin air, particularly since I was the only one with the key. I started looking around the house for the hammer. I went from my room into the main corridor, which grew darker as it went on and was only lit by the moonlight coming from the foyer. There was no sign of a hammer. I went inside the closest bedroom from the foyer. There was nothing there, too. Since it was October, night was approaching quickly, and the only light I had was the moon shining through the tattered curtains on the windows. I was regretting not bringing a torch, but I wasn't very afraid. Then I noticed my hammer as I looked from the bedroom I was in into the dining room. It was on the floor of the dining room. My hammer was on the hardwood floor, close to the dining room window. I was about to grab it when the door in front of me suddenly closed. Nevertheless, I heard the door behind me loudly and simultaneously closed. Despite closing in different directions, both doors had closed simultaneously. The wind couldn't be the cause. The wind would have blown the other open if it had blown the first one closed. Since every window in the home was closed, there could be no wind. Not wind, please, another stuff. I had just picked up the hammer from the floor when something else banged both doors shut. I was genuinely afraid at that moment. An adrenaline rush swept me through the bedroom, the hallway, the foyer, and out the front door as I sprinted to the closest door and swung it open. I made the decision to put off finishing my room until the weekend, when Jason and James would be visiting. Most people would have most likely given renting the house a serious second thought at this time. However, I remained completely doubtful at the moment. Even if I was unable to provide an explanation for the slamming of doors in different directions or the muttering, "Oh no, it might have been rats," it made no difference. I wasn't going to live in my dad's house. I was going to live somewhere I could afford. I was resolved to get past the peculiarities of a house that was more than a century old, living in a place with an enigmatic past. possibly a hint of satanic worship, was perfectly acceptable. A location that had witnessed innumerable parties and unrestrained drug use. And most importantly, ghosts don't exist, do they? In my entire life, I could not have been more mistaken. I was in Kansas. A community hospital was where I worked. Even though I had a few minor interactions of my own, they pale in comparison to trustworthy sources I worked with when I was enlisted there. Among the oldest Army installations is this one. Books about several documented hauntings, especially those involving officers' residences and even specific addresses, can be purchased or easily located on Google. I heard some of the most eerie stories I've ever heard while I was there. We learned that one of our OB/GYN surgeons had relocated with her spouse and 2 toddlers from her home on post to a residence off post. All she said was that her house was haunted. They decided to proceed right away after she caved in to their demands for further information and provided 2 accounts. When the family got home from grocery shopping one day, they discovered that every cabinet door and drawer in the kitchen was open. That was not how they had left the house. They were worried about this alone, but it wasn't enough to frighten them off. On a second occasion, they hosted guests in their 2-story home one evening. The 2 young youngsters under 3 slept upstairs while they entertained below. One of the grown-ups went up to see how the kids were doing after hearing a disturbance coming from upstairs. At first, they assumed they were playing and awake. They beckoned for everyone to come up and take a look when they reached the top of the stairs. Everyone complied. Everyone's blood ran cold when they discovered what they did. There was a haphazard pile of all their bedding, including sheets, blankets, comforters, duvet and pillow covers, and more, in the center of the hallway. The heap nearly reached the ceiling. Given the height of the blanket tower, these very young children could never have done it, and they were sound asleep in their cots. That was the final nail in the coffin that forced them to leave as soon as possible. I learned of a spooky story about a pilot acquaintance who was living in either the surgeon's house or one of the 5 houses next to an airstrip from a doctor on the other end of the hospital. One morning, when he opened the stairs into his kitchen, he discovered all of his canned items open and nicely arranged on the counter next to one another. I can't remember if he stayed or went. I was also told about this man's ghost cat. Despite the death of their cherished family cat, friends and family occasionally saw it at their house, as evident as day. Many encounters were had by a nurse who used to reside in one of the infamously haunted houses in F.T. Riley. They didn't move either till they turned malevolent. In one instance, they returned from a brief escape to discover the police at their home, but they didn't have the experience of what one learns about what typically occurs in that specific home. Perplexed, they asked why they were there. They were notified by the MPs that someone had called 911 from their residence. They cried out in alarm that they had only just come after spending the weekend away. The cops searched and looked inside the property because they thought someone might be breaking in. Although they were unable to clarify the call they had received, they later issued their all clear. On 2 more instances, her husband felt a shove on his back at the top of the stairs with no one behind him, as well as their adolescent son. In fact, the thrust had somewhat hurt him. They made the decision to depart at that point. We frequently had 24-hour in-house call duty, although as I mentioned before, my personal accounts don't compare. After all tasks were completed, we could sleep on a couch in the break room, but we still needed to be present in case of emergency. I was laying one night with my back against the wall or couch and my back to the room. The door connecting the patient holding area to the break room hallway is hefty and opens audibly, but our break room door remained open. The sound of that door opening is enough to wake someone up, even if they are in a deep slumber, and it also shuts loudly by itself. I felt a finger stab me in the back when I woke up. I remained motionless, kept my eyes closed, and ignored it until I dozed off again. Nothing was what I wanted to see. Another evening, I was in the break room watching a movie when I heard the door open. Nothing out of the ordinary, since the dressing rooms are attached to the break room. Ward nurses, surgeons, and anesthesiologists might enter at any time. However, I didn't hear any footsteps. The door simply swings open, then closes again. I couldn't look because I was too chicken. I remained motionless, certain that a ghost had simply entered or exited. I had no interest in finding out. It was a spooky location to be by yourself late at night. At Fort Riley, I've heard a couple more good ones. When I write about my adventures in South Carolina, things will get extremely fascinating.